Okay, so in this week, we're gonna talk a little bit about threat intelligence and reconnaissance. Some of the component of this course is kind of similar to your pen test class or your ethical hacking class. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna get into more of an analysis perspective, the tools that you're gonna be using, some resources that you can access that the industry provides. Um, this is gonna help especially if you become an analyst, or they call it now a lot of the time risk engineer or threat engineer, which is like the mid-tier compared to what you see with cybersecurity specialists, right? So at the beginning of the chapter, it goes over threat intelligence. And we talked about how we would need to gather the information and establish a ground on the understanding of the target, right? So in your case, even if you're on the network defense side, or if you are analyzing your infrastructure, you're still going to need to gather the intelligence from a perspective of an outsider, maybe an attacker that is looking in. So there are three levels of your threat intelligence. The first level is going to be your strategic threat intelligence. This is when you're going to get a broader information of the threat and the threat actors for the organization. And this is a way that we can build an understanding of the trend. So for example, right, if you're aware of a certain type of ransomware that's impacting a certain type of industry, and your organization is part of that industry, right? It is just gathering a little bit more information about that particular malware, and be able to understand like how to be able to build additional solutions to help your organization defend against that type of attack. Second is going to be your tactical threat intelligence. This is when you're going to get deeper into the technical detail. So not just getting the name of the ransomware, maybe the historical information about how it's impacting other organizations that's similar to yours, but now we are going to look at the behavior, right? What kind of encryption tool it's using? Is it reversible? In the case of ransomware, a lot of the time now, the decision is that we are not going to pay for the key because typically it's irreversible, right? And how it spreads across the network, what kind of payload it's coming in as. And so typically in the second area, the tactical area, we're going to have to take a look at the technical, right? The type of files or file extensions, its behavior, and then how it would be helpful for you to be able to do the training or provide some resources and updating your security software against it. And then the third area is operational. Okay, let me flip to the assignment, which is part of number 1. Operational threat intelligence. This is going to be more details in how you respond to a specific threat, such as we're going to find out where is that ransomware coming from, how it changes in the landscape, right? Because sometimes when it gets into an organization, it would behave a certain way, but then the same version of it, right? Because sometimes they create the code where it would alter based on your hardware, or the type of systems that it is impacting. So if there's changes throughout, what is its capability, right, across your infrastructure? Is it targeting specific type of systems? It's a lot of the times ransomware is really designed to lock data, so it's going to look for critical information, sensitive information, right? So looking at its potential and the behavior overall. So this is the next level up, but we're going to look at how it's going to impact the operation of the business. And that's the important takeaway. So when you are gathering threat intelligence, you're always going to operate into these 3 categories. One is the more general information to understand the behavior, the baseline. Second is going to be more on the technical side, right? And that's going to help us with configuration updates, closing out that vulnerability, because a lot of the time exploit really stem from the vulnerability. So threat intelligence is understanding what kind of actor that's going to be using your vulnerability for the exploit. Okay. So I put down some of the category and how it should be used. So for the strategic area, we want to use it to develop an overall security plan. So in security plan, we have to really assess a lot of the things, including policies, right? The rules that we set, because the written rules are going to be carried into the configuration of your system, how you're going to be able to allow and prevent certain things. It also going to have things like looking at your potential downtime, right? What kind of impact level that you're going to be facing. And then for the second area, we are going to use the technical information, the insight that we're going to get from this threat intelligence, the tactical, to be able to provide the configuration. So if you're looking at attacks or breaches, typically we're going to use the information we have, like from the logs, historical logs, if we have had cases, or we would research the information available through some resources. I'm going to share with you some of those. And then we would be able to configure like our border gateway firewall, application firewall, things that our security system needs to examine, right? Because that is going to be a potential threat that's coming in. So it's mostly used for configuration purposes in the second area. And then for the third, we also use that for configuration, but ultimately we're going to build that back into the security by implementing some tactic to make sure that we prevent that from happening. So if we are effectively doing this, right, I think a lot of the times we are going to have a better solution in security. And if you actively gather your threat intelligence, if you gather your threat information and you would continue to implement that into your security area, I think that we are better in preventative than reactive. Okay. Any question? Okay, so you can find the general information for this section for the 3 categories on your notes. Okay. Now, before we going into the second question, I want to share with you, I put a lot of effort into building this course resources because I think it's going to be useful. Most of you are going to be working even as a specialist this when you are responding to threats, right? Some information and insight that you're going to have is going to be useful. So I put some links. You can find a lot of the resources available with Senki. Even Microsoft Threat Intelligence, SANS Internet Storm Center. So the industry had built a lot of the repository for you to be able to learn more about threats. Are we going to be able to know everything, all the threats in the world? No, right? But you need to be current. This is why the cybersecurity industry is very fluid because it changes all the time, right? So you have to keep up with it. Malware areas, IoT areas. So there's specific focus in various depending on the industry that you're working with and also your company. But these are some general resources that you can also go into and be able to find like the common current threat that you're dealing with, right? Or you can also drill it down to specific vendor. More than 80% of the business use Microsoft products, so we want to be more aware of what Microsoft is facing, right? And so on. In some cases, you do see some software that use proprietary threat intelligence. These packages tend to be costly, right? For example, if you work for a company like Drive or specific security solution company, they are going to use some of this, but they also have repository that they create that makes them right a higher level than your typical IT service company that is, comparable to them. So sometimes you would have closed sources and some tools. But when you're assessing your threat, you need to ask yourself these three questions. Is it timely? Right? Because if you are looking as it changes so quickly, if you're looking at something that was far back, right, it might not be relevant. And also, if you spend a lot of time doing this, by the time that you're done, so for example, if you spend more than months to gather your threats, right, your threat might change because of the way, right, your systems might change as well in that process. Is your information accurate? Because just like the resources online might not be completely accurate, even what AI provides, right? As you know that a lot of the information it's just going to pull from the data that it's acquiring. So we want to ask if it's timely, if it's accurate, and if it's relevant. Okay. Is it relevant to your type of systems, to the operation, like the type of business? And especially when we're dealing with certain type of system, like financial system, transactional systems, and so on. Okay. And then I put down the typical rank that you would see. So if the threat is confirmed or it's real, it's going to rank between 90 to 100%. So as you go lower, that threat is not probable. That means that it might not even be impacting. Okay. So if it's discredited, then it's going to be at the lowest. That's going to be 1. Whereas if it's ranking high, right, that means that it is probable and it is going to be impacting. So you need to address the critical systems that's facing the threat that is probable. Okay. And then I put the link for you to look at your Threat Connect rating systems. Familiarize yourself with this because I think, even if you might not have like current existing experience in this, but if you're knowledge in this, a lot of the companies look for this type of things, these skills that exist in an analyst. So when you're looking at a threat indicator that could be from the exchange, a lot of the times they're going to come in as XML file. It might not be all user friendly. So for example, I took a screenshot. So it's going to pull the information, your threat information, it's going to come down this way because it's coming from the database, right? It's going to give you some general information. Now you can parse this for the XML, or if you put it in like a CSV file, you can use a data analytics tool to be able to screen or filter out some of this information. But it's going to give you general information like this, like when it was created, when it was modified, right? The MAC information, the name. This one is, and then the description of the threat. Now, if the threat is unknown, some security system might flag it, and then you will have to do additional research, right, by going into some of the resources. So I provide you some threat information expression, the sticks, it will look something like this. And then if you go into the trusted automated exchange indicator information, this is known as taxi protocol, right? You can also refer to their documentation. So there are a lot of different type of resources that you can rely on, right? You just have to know when to be able to access it, how it's relevant to your particular task. Open OIC is very popular as well. This is a way that we can examine the indicators for our threats. So like what makes it a threat, right? What kind of characteristics is it going to have? So what they did was they actually categorize and describe or reference the threat. And so you can use the link to also take a look at it. And again, it is in XML. Okay. Any question? Okay, so we answered number 1. We found that on our notes. For number 2, what you're gonna do is you're gonna visit virus share. Some of you saw this before, right? Might be in my class or another class. This is an online resource that's going to give you some common current malware sample. Okay. So let's say that if you're facing malware and you don't know what kind of malware that is because your software doesn't identify the type of malware based on its signature or behavior. You can submit your file to VirusShare and it's going to track across to look at the code that was written for that particular malware. As you know, close to 50% of the malware is unknown in the internet, right? So even if you use anti-malware, your anti-malware can only detect the 60% that is known typically, or even lower, okay? So we can go to the website. You can press Control and click or copy paste the link. And it's going to open this up. And so it changes over time where they would showcase or they would share, right, the type of malware. So in this case, what we see is we would see the hash. And when they document a certain type of malware, you're going to see that they would provide the hash information for that particular malware. Okay. And then if you go down, you're going to see that this is Linux based and it would be identified as different names across different type of anti-malware systems or application. So Bitdefender, it's going to label it like this, but ultimately you would see a general name, right? And this is a Trojan. So Trojan hides in but except for Kaspersky, they actually labeled it as a virus. Also SANG4, right? So in some cases, you might not get specific behavior. So you can also research a little bit more, right? EXIF data for that particular malware. It shows you here. It's impacting your x86, 64. So your typical Linux or PC-based systems. And sometimes these type of malware is low-level coded. So the hardware information is also useful. As low coded, if you are doing low-level programming, you're really coding to the processor. Okay. So you can put down the information. So as you research, right? So if your threat is like a malware, you can go to VirusShare. You can look up the information. You can also use it to identify your malware. When you document, you want to document the hashes, right? NV5 is typically used because it exists in all systems. You can also add the other hashes. And we want to also document the size and the file type. Any question? Okay. So I want to share with you some resources from our government, CISA. So if you click the link for number 3, it's going to take you here, right? This is a way that our government shares some of the vulnerabilities that exist across different vendor. By regulation, every vendor, when they identify a vulnerability or multiple vulnerabilities on their system, they have to document it from software to hardware level. So let's say that you are using industrial systems, right? And you are trying to see if your industrial systems is impacted, right? Or if it has a vulnerability that can be exploited, okay? So what you can do is you can visit the site, okay? You can read some guidance. They have some news. So if you go down to the right-hand side, you're going to see a button, the blue button. It says View All Alerts and Advisories. So advisories really pertain to vulnerabilities that is documented for different type of systems, you can also subscribe to them. So you're going to click this button right here. Okay. You can also use the link that's provided for you before that. It doesn't matter with you which product you're going to choose. The whole point is to take you to the site so that way you know how to use it. Okay. And so what you can do is you can also filter out some information, like you want analysis report, you want cybersecurity advisory, you can also select, right? So what I'm going to do is, let me see. And it changes, right? Since, let's go back. Let's say if we could. I'm gonna, unlike the Wednesday section, I'm gonna see if I can give you, I guess it's gonna give you some of the more. So it doesn't matter if you're selecting alert or advisory, because a lot of these things go hand in hand. So let's say that we're going to select one of these things. So you can click, just gonna click this one. Okay, so you can click a link that is provided to you after you select view all advisories. And what you can do is you can go through and you can read it. Now, if this is going to be specific to your system and product, right? That will be the documented vulnerability. And again, you can also search for keywords. You can also filter that out. And so typically you're going to get a CVE. And when you click that CVE, it's going to take you to additional documentation that is for that particular system, right? So it tells you the version that was affected. So to answer the question, if you don't have a VU number, that's okay, because sometimes they don't have that. But give me a general description of that vulnerability, the one that you select. And then if you have a CVE number, right, you're going to also include that right here. So when I took a look at this, I keep clicking that. So let's go back real quick, right? So what I did was I went to view. I click on view all alerts and advisory once I land on the page, and you can scroll down. You can click any of these. So I'm going to click the exploited vulnerability to catalog, and you can also go to the next one if you want. So this is the recent information, right? And here you will be able to find the CVE. And if you click that CVE, right, common vulnerabilities record, it's going to tell you like the score. That's important for an analyst, because if you see that the severity is high like this, right? If you're using this product, you must fix now, right? So it tells you FileZen contains OS command injection vulnerability. When FileZen antivirus check option is enabled, a logged in user may send a specific HTTP request executed an arbitrary OS command. So that's your general description, right? So that means that they don't have input validation for this software. You understand? So they're not controlling the script for this particular system, right? So, and it tells you the version number. So hopefully, right, they have a fix for it. And so it tells you 8.8 or 8.7. That's pretty high out of 10. And then if you click learn more, they will tell you whether there is fixes or additional information for it. No, that's just for description, so. Yeah, so if you click the CWE, common weakness, it's going to tell you like how the command is used to be executed, right? They have tested this, so it shows that there's injection capability. And so they can execute unauthorized operating system commands. So that means that it typically would use the OS library and then somehow it's able to do operating system command. So operating system command is low level command, right? Your operating system command from things like shutdown to like power on, power off, restart. Those things are part of your system operating system command right here. So as an analyst, you're gonna have to go in and read like how they tested it. And then if you're using this, you need to be able to see if they have a fix for it. If they don't have a fix for it, you need to make sure that this particular software will not be allowing any kind of executable command. So we would probably have to prevent like injection for scripts, so blocking any kind of script that is remotely sending to this particular software. So you can use an NPS for that or an IPS. So as you learn in programming courses, right, input validation is super important. And you see this as a vulnerability in your software. So that's one example. You can use other links to look at some information. So your impact level is going to be high because it's ranking 8.8 or 8.7, right? See if it has a solution. Sometime if it's too soon, they might not have a new version, right? So it's affecting version 5.0, 5.0.10 for that, right? It also affected the prior version, 4.2, 4.21. So it doesn't list any kind of solution. So that means that it's kind of new, right? So in this gap, you often see that sometimes they have exploitation happening because there's no fix for it yet, right? Or sometimes you also have 0 day because an existing vulnerability. Any question? So you have to follow these type of threads, right? Especially if you're using a certain product, or just identify the vulnerability and how it's impacting your organization is important. Okay. The next thing I wanted to share with you is from Mandiant. And we talked a little bit about OpenIOC. So you're gonna go ahead and click the link for number 4. And it talks about the format of OpenIOC, the use case. And so this is typically used to look for malware and utility. So I put down the question asks you, how can an organization subscribe to OpenIOC platforms to gather intelligence on threats? So this is going to give you attributes or binary files for the identified malware or utility. It can be used to search for registry keys, and this is typically for Windows environment. So in your Windows system, anytime that you install hardware or software, right, it update the registry keys, okay? Now for executable, you need to do a run key, right? And typically malware needs to have some kind of run to your utility, right? Malicious utility tend to have some kind of execution and it might require the run keys. It also provides you with feeds related to IP addresses, hash values of malware and utility. Like when it's released from a certain public IP address, because typically it comes from a system, right? A server that gets distributed to the wild. Its hash value to really identify that specific malware or utility. And then it also allows you to compare metadata files containing execution tools or backdoors. So if you are working directly with a malware as a threat, right, this resource is useful for you. Any question? And metadata of files is going to tell you like the nature of that file, a little bit on its property or attributes. Okay. Because malware comes in all different shape and sizes. So when you look at like a certain type of Trojan, it's impacting like what we saw earlier with Linux. When you look at the metadata, right? As you scroll down, it talks a little bit about the EXIF, which is part of the metadata of that particular file. So it allows you to compare, right, the metadata files for the malware. So you might have like the same type of malware, but it has multiple files, right? So you will be able to compare that. So the back work is kind of done for you already, right? If they identify like the server that's distributing the malware, they document that. And then so it's a tool. So typically you can just go in and read. So that's where I can get the information from. It talks about the components using Mandiant IOC editor, and they screenshot it. So this is a tool that you can use to examine it actually. Okay. All right. Okay. In the next part, it goes into threat intelligence lifecycle, which is the next section of your notes. And we just want to really look at the activities, the task that takes place in the life cycle. So the first thing you need to do is to gather the requirements based on historical events, right? Previous breaches, if you come across that, the trends, also looking at the baselines, and then any kind of risk assessment results that were done before. So we're going to look at the requirements depending on the objective of your particular assessment, right? So if you're looking at things like, oh, I wanted to see if there's any potential data leak that's going to exist in my organization, then we have to look at the breaches, right? Or in the case that if you're assessing threat, right, from looking for malware like ransomware, then you're looking at the trends. So if they have never faced that before, then you're going to look at similar cases that's going to be impacting an organization that's like yours. The second things that you're going to need to do after you gather the requirements from the data and the risk results, then you're going to collect the data from intelligent sources. So like I mentioned to you, right, you have some resources that you can go to for malware. You also have some resources that you can refer to in part of your notes. So you're going to go to the web resources, the databases, right? The DB to be able to identify and collect information. Importantly, you need to, before you get to the third step, you need to clean up your data. So ask yourself those three questions. Is it timely? Is it relevant? Right? So And then you're going to consolidate your data. So before you analyze, you're going to clean up your data. So when we consolidate the data, we basically just making sure that it is useful for our information, for what we're doing, and then we're going to process it. So statistically, we want to be able to interpret the probable of our potential threats, right? We would analyze it. You can use analytical tools. And some of the security management system comes with some analytical tools. You can also use your own like scripts and also your own tools to be able to interpret that data. So first you got to analyze it and then you want to be able to interpret it. What does this mean, right? This percentage level, how is that going to impact our organization? So once you interpret it, you would then put it on a report and then you send it to your directors, your managers, your team members. And then once you do that, then you're going to obtain their feedback. And we want to also improve from that. Now, if you work for a security service company, this report goes to your client, right? So if you're a consultant, if you are an employee of the security service company, they are going to give you a limited time. Sometimes, and this is the stressful part about the job, is you have 24 hours, right, to give them this report. You have to look for the threat, you have to analyze it, right, and you have to prevent it. So, and then you are going to report, and sometimes you might not need to do any prevention. You just need to give them the report. They take it to their IT team, and then their IT team will do the implementation after that. Okay? So sometimes you have a very limited window to do that. So that's why you have to be comfortable with the resources that's available to you, so that way you know when to use it and when to use it effectively. Okay? And that's why you get paid big bucks. So on average, you're gonna see like threat engineers, threat analysts, these risk analysts, they would label them like that. They make on average 150 and up, right? It requires you to have some, former experience in different areas, but this is the type of work that you're gonna be doing. And you can work 100% remote or partially remote. Any question? Okay, so the threat intelligence life cycle and all the stages, right? And the breakdown for that, I basically summarized the section for you in that answer. Next, we're going to talk about the community. So, decades ago, a lot of the professional that you see now, right, even older than me, we didn't have these type of resources. So the industry has been really good at building out some of these things for the newer professional or the existing professional to be operating in. So the community provides you with 3 areas of ISAC. That stands for Information Sharing and Analysis Center. They focus on the primary 3 industry: healthcare, financial, and aviation. But if you work in other areas like education or other sector, you can go to their other links. Okay? So we would answer that question. What's the purpose of your ISAC or Information Sharing and Analysis Centers? It's really a way to share information, the tools, and to assist the community members. So you can sign up for that, right? You can ask questions, you can share resources to other people, and it focused on the 3 critical, right, sectors. But there is another link that you can go to if your company doesn't fall into these 3 areas. Okay, any question? So for the next question, it asks you about what type of threat actors have the most resources, right? What type of threat actors are the most dangerous and difficult to detect? So nation state naturally have the most resources because a lot of them are sponsored by a nation or an organization that's very large, right? So when we're looking at like APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, those groups are targeting specific entity, right? Like a country, like a company, and so on. So nation state has the most resources, and in cybersecurity, it's a race between time and resources, right? So when you're looking at attacks are performed, and if the attacks are successful, it's because they have the available resources for that attack to happen. Okay. And the type of threats that is harder and difficult for you to detect is going to be your insider threats. And this is what we see now with a lot of these type of cases where inside a certain government agency, right, they have to go through a lot of clearance and background checks just to make sure that the person that's inside cannot be bought, right? They will not commit fraudulent activity because it is really harder to really identify that threat once they're already inside the organization. And so when you're looking at cases that the CIA or the FBI are working at, you would see that they investigate. And I went to some of the conferences or the presentation. You would see all kinds of different type of insider threats, from internal engineers all the way to like professors. Okay, that is working on specific type of projects or design, and they are filtering out information. Example, right? Like Boeing design that's been leaked, and they have traced it back to certain group that's actually obtaining that and selling it to aviation company that's out of China. And so, sure enough, right, as soon as we release the next Boeing plane, uh, they already came up with a comparable one. So you have competitive advantage sometimes with companies and organizations, and also nations. Okay. Any question? Okay. So here, it talks about your threat actors, right? You probably have seen this before from CIS-47 or another cybersecurity course. So nation state, they have the most tools and resources and talent. And as you can see, if you look up APT, even on Wikipedia or Ask AI, right, you would see there's a growing list for it. And it changes over time. So, and there's usually typically you have the leading advanced persistent threat groups. Okay. And then you got the organized group crime groups. Typically you see these for like identity theft, phishing, campaign, ransom attacks, ransomware attacks, and so on. And then your hacktivists like anonymous and different groups for political or certain type of ideology. And then your insider threat, we talked about that. So let's say that when you go through and you identify a threat, how do you classify it? What kind of areas do you really want to label it in, right? So this is how Microsoft labels or classify the threats. If that threat is spoofing identity, it is a threat. So in our system, the identity is typically just IP address or physical address, UID or MAC, right? If the threat is tampering with files, objects, or like systems, files, containers, and so on, that's a threat. If there's repudiation, if there's information disclosure, right? Because some type of malware or attacker would infiltrate, right? And then take the data and send that out, right? Leak the data. If there's denial of service, right? Making your system become unavailable. And if there's elevation of privilege. Okay. So when you're looking at the threat, if it meets one or multiple of these categories, right? It is a threat. So other models that you can refer to PASTA, which is Process Attack Simulation of Threat Analysis, right? Linden or CVSS. I think if you're familiar with Microsoft Strides, you're also familiar with CVSS. Okay. So first for 8, we can go through and we can add a little bit more, right? So 8, it asks you to list Microsoft Stride's threat classification categories, provide an example of events or activities in each category. So when you have spoof of user identity, that's typically your IP or MAC or user account, user impersonation. In tampering, that could also be deleting, modifying files, server objects, container, right? Like cloud container or server container. It could be a Docker for the actual server local Docker, or it could also be an instance, virtual machines, etc. Right? A lot of these servers actually is spin or used from a VM. And then repudiation just means that they change or delete logs, clean up the tracks. So in encryption, we say that there's non-repudiation. That means that once we encrypt, right, there's a record of it because it changes the state of that file. But when you say repudiation, that means that there's potential change in a specific object. So if you have like logs in Windows environment, that will be an event on the event viewer. So if there's repudiation, that means that they can go in and edit your log or delete your log to clear up the tracks, right? So when you're looking at like a threat, like an attacker, that can happen. Typically that they would perform multiple activities in these categories to get into your system. Information disclosure, a lot of the data leak end up on the dark web, which is a server, right? That is used to exchange different type of information. And then denial of service, that just making your systems or your server become unavailable. And then elevation of privilege is to change your user rights and elevate it so that way they can perform unauthorized access. So in the attack event, an attacker can access a regular user account because they maybe fish out the credential information. And then through that, right, they might modify something on the authentication system or run a script, etc., to be able to change the privilege of that user. So when we say privilege, it really pertains to what they can do on that system. So that user rights is modified. Like I can, change the clock, right? And that can impact synchronization of my server. I can shut down my server, right? typically servers don't get shut down, and most user accounts on there cannot shut down system. Okay. But you have to be like an admin or root user, right, to be able to really shut it down, especially after you run updates. So in elevation of privilege, typically it's a move, right? In this category, so in an attack event, you're gonna see that many of these categories are used. Do you have any question for me? Okay. I'm gonna take 8 down so that way we can look at the next question, but you can go to also the notes and you can visit online. Microsoft is good at describing the categories of threats under STRIDE. So STRIDE stands for STRIDE, right? These categories. Okay, I'm gonna move this down so we can continue. Let's move this up. So why do we classify threats then? Right? So that way, ultimately, we can use a framework to, number one, describe what it is. Number two, to be able to share the resources and incorporate other entity to be able to help us. And then to manage information. Otherwise, you're just gonna have a hodgepodge of information, right? Because for the same thing. So it's gonna universally streamline that information on how it's shared across. And also to be able to have more of a knowledge of that threat and to perform better analysis. So that allows us to use a specific model, right, to manage our threat. Okay, so if you're working ahead, you can go to Talos Intelligence, Reputation Center, and then you can put in an IP address. And this particular IP address you using, and when you do that, you would see who's the owner of that IP address. So when a company acquire a public IP address, it will be registered to them, just like how if someone buys a house, right, they are registered to that address as a homeowner. And so it will tell you that IP address belongs to a certain company and there's domain or related IP address. So for a tech company, you typically see that if they're running cloud centers or data center, or they have many different campuses and location, you typically would see a range of IP address that they have obtained. And in this particular reputation center, it's going to tell you information like their email and so on. Okay. So we can, and some of you have seen this before. I think in my CIS-47, I also introduced this. So when you visit the reputation center, you can put down your host name, domain, right? Like xyz.com, the network owner, and IP reputation. Now, in the case that if we are getting an IP, let's say an unknown IP, maybe from China or North Korea, right? You can plug it into some of these resources you can use, and the Reputation Center also have a link to Whois, but it's not very effective. So you can also use Whois to really identify, like, if that IP is registered by someone else. And typically in the form of attack, you would see that they spoof the IP, or they use an IP that is not traceable, right? If they actually prepare for that particular attack. So it is a way for us to research additional information on the ownership of that IP and that domain. Okay. So we're going to plug that in, 8.8.8.8. This is an IP version 4, right? You would see that host name is dns.google. The owner is Google. And it's basically neutral. And in some cases, you might not find details unless you request for it, because they might have a certain protection for that, right? And then you can also see related IP address. Here's the Whois tab. So it tells you it doesn't have any additional information here. And then your email volume history. Because your DNS is typically related to your domain, right? And domain is typically related to exchange or mail. And on the DNS, if you have an email server, that will be an MX record, right? Hence, in order to send any kind of email, you have to have a domain, like rccd.edu, right? So this is why it's able to track like email information, email volume. You can also select this option like email and spam trends. Right? I didn't mention that on Wednesday, but to be able to find out more about that area if you're interested in that. So for 10, we just look at the reputation of that IP address. We'll look at who owns it, which domain it belongs to. Now, Talos Intelligence also have other information such as vulnerability. So if you click this for the next question, number 11, it's going to take you to some disclosed vulnerability, right? I think that this is a little bit easier to digest compared to what you've seen with CISA. However, you have different sources, so you would see sometime that if they report it to Talos, then you would have it documented here, right? Your CVE number, that's this close, or that's this close, right? Sometimes it's not. And then you also have different vendor on the 0-day vulnerability. So as you can see, there's a lot, right? For 0-day. And this is why you would see 0-day attack. So if you look at the list changes over time, right? You have GeoVision, you have media area, you have different vendor that is reporting the vulnerabilities. So if you click like here, you can also find pages and pages of it. You can also search for specific entry. Here's Canva. Anybody use Canva? My colleagues love it, but um, so there's different ones as you go, and it basically categorized by the reporting date, but not always, right? So if your vendor is on the list, you can document and research more. Okay. So then we're gonna get further into the analysis, and we want to refer to a certain model. So for number 12, it asks you what type of model helps analysts discover more information by highlighting the relationship between elements of security events, right? That's the key. And that's going to be your diamond model of intrusion analysis. So we talked about reputation, so that's going to be research. So when you gather the intelligence, you can also visit the center like what we talked about. I forgot to mention before the model, you can also use Mitre attack, right? If you've seen it before, it's if you haven't seen it, check it out. It tells you a lot of the tactics from different types of attacks that's been documented, the techniques, the tools that they use, some of the common knowledge, even recommendation on how you can defend from IoT systems all the way to wireless systems, to different operating systems, to cloud computing. They have a vast amount and they do a really good job at documenting, right? So if you go to Mitre, okay, you can go through and it really breaks it down into attack phases, right? Recon right here, okay? So if we look at active scanning, I think we talked about that before. There's some examples, pre-compromise, how, detection for active scanning is used. And then if you go into like some of the later, like for persistence, a lot of the times, like sometimes they would place a backdoor or they would use like a boot on scripts or a login scripts, and you would see all different types. Right here, I talked about APT. So APT 29 and 41 had used that. So they use a hidden shell script. And this is a Linux system, so you can tell because of the directory right here. And they put a rootkit there, right? So it's a really good resource to refer to. And so following that, you would see the diamond model intrusion analysis. So this is going to tell you the capability of the target based on the events, okay? So starting from number 1, you're going to see that first, right, reaction approach is that if we're being attacked, we're going to say from a network standpoint or a system standpoint, maybe alarm is going off, right, that you're being attacked or your system is shutting down. So the discovery happening here. Okay. Then we would move into analyzing the logs to see how, like which systems that they actually entered from and which IP addresses they use. So you have to go through network logs to really see like which system that they entered. And then we are going to go into our security management system to look at additional activity on the network. Because once they enter, it's like entering someone's house. If a robber wants to go in and steal something, right? We want to see which door did they enter into that house, right? Which room did they go into and what did they take? right? So in your security management system, we would then look at the logs to show if there's any kind of activities or if there's any kind of alarm even, right? Or prevention there. And so if we don't have these, right, that means that either they delete the logs or our system just not detecting their activity. It's failing. And then if you move to 4, right, hopefully by this time, you would be able to identify more of who they are. So like I said to you before, if you're spoofing an identity as an attacker, you have to keep doing it at every single point, because coming in from the outside, you have to verify that you're part of this network with the firewall so it allows you in. Once you're in, there's intrusion prevention system and internal system that you need to also validate. So you have to take on internal identity in order to move forward, right? So we want to start tracking here. So we would be able to look at, like, if we have internal security appliance, you need to look at those logs and you need to follow their path, okay? And so once you identify their identity, then you can determine the capability. This part typically is the longest right here, between 3 and 5, okay? Because the other stuff is kind of easy. You should be able to look at it from your network monitoring systems and your firewall logs and so on. But as you move, and in an enterprise environment, when you have all different type of networks and things that are interconnected, you have to, and sometimes you have limited time to do that, right? So when we do an analysis for this, if you follow this model, it's kind of straightforward, step by step. It gives you the breakdown on where to go next, okay? Okay, so that should address number 12. And when we're looking at pen testing or attack model, you typically hear of the Lockheed Martin kill chain model. This gives you the stages and the activities in each stage, especially in attack. So when we're looking at number 13, it asks you to describe the activities that takes place in the first stage of Lockheed kill chain model. How can a security professional detect and combat these activities in the first stage of the model? So if they are successful in the beginning, they're going to be able to prepare the tools and launch an attack. So if you detect it early and combat it early, you prevent a lot of things. Okay? Even though you're reacting at the beginning, but you prevent further damages if you do that in the first stage. And that's the goal. So in the reconnaissance stage at the beginning, the attacker would then select a target. So typically they would scan the target, they would research the target, they would gather the information, whether they're doing it passively or actively, they are going to try to find as much information on that target as possible. So some of the things that they would be doing is to use a tool, right? And you're going to see that in Kali Intelligence Suite today. Everything can be automated because a lot of these tools are Python scripts. So they can use a harvester to harvest email addresses. They know that this enterprise, for example, Nike.com, would have Nike.com as part of their email addresses, right? They can also find that on professional social media websites, different things like job listings. So these tools can harvest email addresses that allows them to identify the targeted employees, executives, directors, right? People who are affiliated with the technical side or the decision-making side. So once they harvest the email, they would identify the employee. You can also use a tool to be able to pull all the social media content from it for that person. Then they can also collect press releases, like, information about the company. Sometimes they might be facing different kind of lawsuits, or they might have new products that they share on their press releases. And in public entity awarded contracts like grants, state funding, etc., is shared publicly. So that can be found on the web. And then in conferences, sometimes they share attendees, speakers, etc. So that information can also be pulled. They would also look for internet-facing servers. Your servers are in the DMZ, your web servers, your FTP servers, right? Sometimes email, or even general public database. So the more homework that they do here, right, the more consistent and effective is the next stage. So in order to detect recon, we can review websites logs because it is public facing. And we can set alerts for specific searching, right? And so on the web development side, you can build this mechanism into your web pages, right? Your website. It should keep a log of who's visiting, even with IP addresses, right? And the type of search they use. And you see a lot of this now that they're using cookies together. So if you go to a website and you search for something, right, they directly marketing that product to you. So we have a lot of that already in place for a lot of the e-commerce portion. You can also incorporate browser analytics in web administration. You can code it where it would look for like the type of browser that they're using when they're visiting your site, right? And then find additional information and analyze that. Okay. So how can we combat this? We want to be able to build some kind of detection for the browsing behavior, especially when we're looking at like from a web perspective, because that's going to be public facing. That's how they're going to be able to identify the servers. And then the next level is going to be the critical servers that are feeding that server information or connecting to those servers. And so we can look for a specific behavior that pertains to reconnaissance, because active and passive reconnaissance really means that either they are actively requesting information from your server and your server is responding, that's active, or they typically searching about your server. So you have to really think about what they're really doing here to really understand, right, how to be able to combat it. How can you detect this type of behavior? And then we want to prioritize this defense around the technology and people. So I think user awareness is important. Like people should be reporting if they see irregular activities, right? And also if you have defense mechanism that's incorporated with your server. So if I'm banner grabbing using like Nmap, right? My detection system should be able to do that because Nmap launch scripts and scripts submits as requests. So what you can do is you can block those scripts using firewall rules. Okay. And that should send you a notification as an admin saying that, oh, these scripts were launched. Because when you run Nmap, you're going to see that it shows like 100 scripts, 1,000 scripts for specific things. even when you do a stealth one, it's still going to launch some kind of scripts. So in any form of attack, you're going to see whether elevation of privilege, spoofing, they are going to run scripts. I can't emphasize enough on how well you need to know scripting, right? Because either you write it or you detect it. Any question? So shell script, Python scripts, web scripts, all of those things are important. Okay. So moving on, number 14. So why is proactive threat hunting essential in organization security? And when you work for security firms or when you are a security professional as an analyst, you need to operate in this area because when you are proactively hunting threat, you are advancing the security posture because you know ahead of what kind of threat that they're facing. And so that way you can mature what they call mature threat modeling to be able to reduce the risk of that threat. We want to reduce it where it would be either omitted or acceptable, right? In most cases, we can't get rid of it 100%. It's just going to be acceptable. And then in the case that it can get really expensive if it happens, then we can make it transferable. We'll just have insurance company cover the damages in the case it happens, like attacks. But there's clause in the security policy now that they might not cover everything, right? Do you guys know that when your data is lost, typically they pay you $1 a piece, right? So in the case that if your health information is lost, you're going to get fined $25,000, but they're only going to give you $1,000 because 1,000 records lost. So you kind of have to look at your policy. And they can also reject your claim, just like how you deal with car insurance or other forms of insurance typically. But cybersecurity insurance now is very expensive, right? So organization will waive the cost and they say, you know what, we're not going to buy security insurance. We're just going to put more money investing in building security solution that's going to be effective. Or in some cases, they're like, oh, the solution we have is okay. We'll just transfer that risk in case an attack happens, a breach happens, etc. Right? We'll take the loss. So in following chapter 2, chapter 3 talk about reconnaissance. And as an analyst, you are going to do some pen testing, right? Because these 2 chapters are going to sound very familiar with your CIS-41A class. But in any cases, you should not do any kind of technique unless you have a written agreement. Internally, as a contractor coming from outside, as an auditor, whatever, consultant, whatever it is that your position would be, nothing is on the table until they agree, sign, and you have a witness. Okay, because you don't want that to come back to you legally. And then you end up in prison because the things that we do is sometimes circumventing the system and it becomes computer abuse law violation, and you don't want that, right? So we want to have an agreement, a written permission that authorizes you to do security analysis. I know it's tempting to go home and scan your neighbor's wireless network. It's illegal. Don't do that, right? But at the same time, we are going to be privileged to a lot of sensitive data and sensitive system, right? So you have to be mindful of that because if you can get in, another source can get in, and it becomes a liability issue. So we want to make sure that when we're doing the security analysis on specific system, we are only doing it on that system. I know you're going to see other things. It's kind of like how you're driving down the road, right? And you see events, accidents, and things like that. But your goal is to get to your job on time. You're going to focus on that, okay? Because sometimes we're going to see outstanding things, anomalies, illegal things. Uh, so if your objective is only on the database, you're just going to focus on that, okay? Because there's going to be temptation for you to look into other things, and when you have a violation of contract, that becomes an issue. Okay, so stick with your objective. Make sure that you only performing the analysis that you are required to do. Okay, so the tools that you can use it for active and passive reconnaissance. I touched a little bit on this earlier. So active reconnaissance directly communicate with your target, right? Like Nmap, you are going to use the target IP address. It's going to submit script to that target, waiting for response. You can also use exploitation toolkit like Metasploit. If you're using ping tool, even a regular ping tool command, right? It's still a direct response. So it asks and it's going to call home. So it's going to come back to you. So things like hping is going to be active. And that's definitely not stealthy. Okay. You can use dig or host command in Linux. Then if you want passive reconnaissance, you can use packet sniffer like Wireshark. Now, this is when I touch on this in ethical hacking class, and some of you have that before. But if you haven't, right, packet sniffer is not completely legal. Okay. It is illegal when you're using your scan for malicious intention or illegal intention. It is legal when you're using it to do just network performance analysis and so on. So if I attach myself to the school wireless network and I scan everybody on it to see how well is my network performing, that's fine. But if I'm attaching myself to a public Wi-Fi, I'm scanning everybody, and I'm looking for someone who's paying their bill online in that time span, and then I want to do, I want to modify the packet or do some kind of session hijack, then it becomes illegal. Okay? So packet sniffer, it's like standing on the road and looking at all the cars that go by. So it is a passive reconnaissance tool. You can also use whois, right? This can be a command and also like a tool in Linux system, or you can also use a website for that. You can use specialized search engine like Shodan and others. So here's the kill chain model that we talked about. I screenshot that for you. And then we talked about threat hunting. Before that, it talks about the CVSS. Typically, this is the scoring system that we would use. It doesn't really directly cover that, but it only shares with you the vulnerability score. So the higher the score, the more critical that vulnerability is. So that means that it is definitely exploitable. So you want to make sure you reduce that. Okay. By updating your system, there's different things that we do to reduce vulnerability. Okay, so reconnaissance here. So on the second part here, I talk a little bit about enumeration. And you see enumeration in a lot of things, like trying to brute force wireless keys. So host enumeration, in this technique, what you can do is you can map out the type of systems, how many routers they have. So when you're running something like Nmap, it does that. It enumerates like how many hops between how far away you are from that network target, right? The target's network. So It gathers that information about the networks, and then it's going to give you some additional details so that way we can, as an attacker, they would then plan on how they're going to get to the target. But from a pen testing perspective, we want to see like how easy or how difficult, how challenging that is to get from where we are to the actual main critical servers. So I put down some documentation that gives you some guidelines, especially in this area, and then on security testing information. We talked about active, right? Nmap, when you run it in Windows system, it's called ZenMap. Okay, ping, and then port scanner, which is Nmap, and others too. So one of the things that your tools can also offer is your operating system fingerprinting. This basically identifies the version of operating system that it's using based on the response to the script. Sometimes it is accurate, sometimes it's not. It depends. So you can use tool like Angry IP Scanner, OpenVAS, Metasploit, Qualys, Vulnerability. So some of these are proprietary and some are open source. This is a very common tool in an IT environment. We use it to look at vulnerability for all our system. You can use the basic version, which is free when you register for an account. If you use the professional version, it's like $2,000 and up. What it does is it sends out requests to all the connected system, wait for response. It's going to keep an inventory of all the connected system. And then for each of those, it's going to look for like weak passwords, missing updates, etc. So Nessus is a good tool to kind of get exposed to. The reason why I don't write labs for this anymore, I used to, is because it takes a long time and they do block this type of request in this particular network, right? So I recommend that you try it on your home network, be familiar with it, and add it to your resume. It is a useful tool for this industry, okay? Some of your search engine that you can use, Shodan, I think some of you have seen this before. It requires an account and an API key for you to run it with Kali Linux and other tools. You also have ZoomEye, Census, Gray Noise. There's many. And then there are security tools for different things for IoT. If you want to gather harvest email address, use Hunter. You're going to see that in KIS today. And so many more, right? And this is like more of the common tool. So you see new ones all the time. Like I said, right? In the nature of our work is about knowing how to use a tool effectively. A lot of the things that you do, you don't have to use from scratch. Like you don't have to build from scratch. You can customize your tool, but there are resources for you and you just have a good tool belt. Okay, so we are gonna do some NS lookup. Some of you know how to do this. So this is part of also network troubleshooting. But let's say that I want to know about my DNS information or my domain, right? I can open up command prompt. So you can do command prompt, right? You can run it as a regular user for most part. Or you can do CMD. So I'm just going to search for command and then I click the app to open. And then I'm on as an account, right, a user on this system. So I'm just going to do NS lookup. And you don't need to put the www in front of it. You just put the domain name. So Microsoft.com. So first, the type of information that it's going to give me is the DNS that I'm using. That DNS IP address. And it's going to give me a non-authoritative answer about my target domain, which is Microsoft.com, and the available addresses. So you do see that they're using v6 and v4, right? IP version 6 and 4. They own more IP addresses than this, but this is the available information that Microsoft is releasing, right? And sometimes they block specific DNS information. So you know that Microsoft has the most public IP address there is. So okay. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna drill it down a little bit more. So I'm teaching you how to do passive, right? So NS lookup, and you are gonna do an option or a switch query equal MX for mail exchange that is related to that domain, Microsoft.com. So again, it's going to give me my local server, my DNS, and then it's going to give me, okay, it's going to give me internet addresses related to my target, right? There's version 4 and version 6. We saw a little bit of that earlier with the summarize for the NS lookup, but when you are looking at mail exchange, these are IP related to their email servers, okay, for that domain. Okay. So for the MX record, you are going to look at the routing costs, right? If you take networking classes or routing and switching class, when you configure, you can configure like a value that allows you to route certain things in priority and also for validation. So 0 is the lowest and 10 is the highest. And 0 is used for routing and 10 is used for validation of that domain. So when you gather the information, it tells me that their email MX record is at a 10, 10. Okay. Any question? So typically in an infrastructure, you know that there's going to be email server, right? In a domain environment, you know that usually there's related systems, and typically email is related to your DNS. Authentication server is related to your DNS. And so on. So 19, I just use a real company. You can visit the website. I want you to do basically passive recon on this organization. What's the name of the company? What is its industry? The locations. If they have more than one, you can note it. If there's organizational hierarchy, like executives, management, staff listed, if there's any related press, whether it's for, some kind of awards or, recognition for partnership, affiliation, and then you also want to note their partners and clients. So if you go to the website, right, it takes you to the about the company. They talk of it generally, tells you a little bit more. Then you can go to the highlights. It tells you their history. The type of industry that they work with, also their clients. You see that for their partners, there's a list, right? So see if you can find the people who work. So go to more about the offices or look around, right? Now, sometimes information is easy to find, sometimes it's not, right? So you want to gather as much information as possible. Okay, I'm gonna stop at around 7. That gives us like an hour and a half to work on our lab. So as we said earlier, how can you prevent someone from actively sending scripts or requests to your system? Pinging your systems, checking your system information. So we would start with these 3 elements. Number 1, we want to limit external exposure of services as much as possible. That kind of reduce the footprint that we have digitally about our organization. Now, that can be a negative, there's negative impact of that, because if your company is an e-commerce company, you have to have digital footprint to market the things that you do, the things that you sell. Okay? So, but we need to really think about like how that really provides internal system information, internal network information, private system information. You can still have exposure, but you can have appropriate exposure and not really disclose too much about your IT operations, right? Your security operations. You can use intrusion prevention system to limit or stop probe. So typically, if you're using security appliances, you can create a rule for it. You can tell it to set off alarm and block it as it does that, right? So I can say that if someone pinged me more than this many times, then drop the request, drop that service, block ICMP. You can still ping, but typically we ping a couple of times, right? So in Windows environment, it sends 4 packets and it receives 4 response if it's successful. In Linux, you can continue to do that, but in a Smurf attack, you're going to see that when they do the nav service, they might ping you to death, right? Or they might run a script to continuously occupying your service. So we can limit the probe, we can limit the request to a certain amount that's tolerable for troubleshooting purposes. We want to use monitoring and alerting system. So important key is everything is interconnected, so we must monitor the network, right? We must be able to have security system to tell us, to alarm us of what's wrong, okay? So if there's an intrusion that needs to go off, if there's anomaly that is, you can always override the request, right? If you approve it. So let's say that if someone is sending a file and they need that file, and for some reason it catches that file as an anomaly, right? It would also go to the IT team, and then they can authorize it to go. So you can make it where it does slow down the process, but ultimately we have a better solution in authorizing and not authorizing, allow or disallowing certain things. Okay. So even if you have AI, and even if you train it, even if you put in these rules and automate it, you still gonna have that conditional requirement from a human perspective, right? To really think about like, should I allow this or shouldn't I allow this? So I think that decision process is still going to be reliant a lot on us, even though like 80% of it can be completely automated and machine ready. And so with that would wrap up our unit 2. I encourage you to go back and look at the notes, right? You can rewatch the video if you missed some portion. And then check out some of the links I have provided. But I put down some screenshots here for you to look at. And then the log files that is recommended. So My recommendation is also learn how to work with logs. I'll try to see if I can incorporate that as part of your lab in the future, to be able to take system logs and parse it, and then identify a certain events or anomalies. Some of you have done this with like Hack the Box or practice with competition. Okay. And then it talks about commands and some resources. So when you gather information, typically, like we saw that from the exercise that we did, we want to look for these things: locations, if there's business workflow, relationships with departments, partners, or individual, organizational charts like staff, management, employees, document analysis. So if you can get some data or metadata information, um, financial data, because if it's publicly traded, they usually have financial reporting quarterly, and require at least a year, right? And so on. Okay, with that, I will come back to here. And then we'll stop recording, take attendance, and then we'll take a short break if you need to. If you don't need to take a break, you can start the lab and I'll walk you through that. Okay, let's